think the first thing we'll do here is just go through some of the questions. And one question here is, why is Foucault the one left out by professors of contemporary philosophy in the work? I think there's two reasons for this. One reason for this, the first reason I would give is just distaste. That it's really hard. It's stomach churning to have to read Foucault because, like, he basically turns nature on its head, and he's trying to describe some sort of a system where passion and madness are the best thing, and being reasonable and orderly are like the worst things. And also, a lot of Foucault's writings are not so much about creating arguments. And so we're so used to, when we get trained, when people in the work get trained as being Thomists, right? They get trained to deal with arguments. And Foucault's writings, they're not so much about arguments as they are creating agonistic situations, right? Situations of competition, of challenge, where you either win or you lose. And so I think that they're not just, so there's a kind of distaste for reading his writings because his writings are about madness and perversion and all sorts of crazy things. And also a lot of his writings are more about, it's funny, for example, only this past year at Harvard, there was a conference on Foucault. And I guess now some of his final works are the critical editions are coming out. So most people, when they go and study a scholar, they go and study the scholar because they like the scholar and they want to promote some of his ideas. It's really hard to do that. Like my friend that wrote a book on Foucault, it was like the toughest 2 years of his life because his stomach was churning the whole time, right? And I think just a lot of people just don't have the stomach for that kind of thing. Also, there's a kind of there's kind of urgency, I think, to try to come up with good arguments to teach people. This is actually one of the defects of, you can see this in the 17th century and in the 18th century in Catholic seminaries throughout Europe, that they're really committed to trying to just preserve the tradition and hand it on to the next generation. So they don't do a lot of engagement with the contemporary authors. If they do engagement with the contemporary authors, they basically just hook, line, and sinker replicate what the contemporary authors were saying, like John Locke, for example, without very little critical assessment. So I think also there's a little bit of lag in that, right? So a lot of the older professors were like, when I was coming of age in the 80s and 90s, Foucault was the thing in the avant-garde, elite political or intellectual environment. But of course, a lot of my teachers, they were raised in the age when Sartre and Camus were the big guns. So we would have courses by Catholic professors critiquing Sartre and Camus, but not so much Foucault. And then but it is a peculiar thing that in this generation, people my age, there's not so many that have dealt, many people just don't even deal with contemporary philosophy, let alone even modern philosophy. I think part of that, I think part of that is that if you look at the history of Thomism, so Thomism essentially, you have St. Thomas Aquinas, right? He dies in 1274, around 1274 he dies. Not long after St. Thomas Aquinas dies, his thought is put aside. Nobody really they don't really embrace Thomism. And if anything, I don't know if you guys study Occam in medieval history, but essentially Occam becomes the superstar philosopher of the late Middle Ages. And Duns Scotus also becomes super big. So in many universities in Europe, by the time you get to the eve of the Reformation, like Martin Luther, he wasn't trained as a Thomist. He was trained as an Occamite, as a nominalist. So nominalism, in a sense, wipes out the first seeds of Thomism, right, at the end of the Middle Ages. And essentially, from the time of the Reformation up until the 19th century, there's just a few pockets here and there of Thomism. There's like the Church of St. Catherine of Siena in Rome, Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome. Like that was a little school of Thomism, right? That preserved Thomism for a while. And then you have Salamanca in Rome, but also by the time you get to the Enlightenment, everybody becomes enamored with John Locke. So by the time you get to like the eve of the French Revolution, there's like one seminary in Spain that's preserved Thomism. Everybody else, like in France and most of Poland and Germany, the seminaries are essentially teaching Lockeanism. Like, so if anybody ever comes to you, this happened to me when I was a graduate student, right? Someone comes to me and says, I have a great idea. We should try to fuse together Thomism and Lockeanism. And of course, I started laughing. I was like, ha, 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 good luck. And they're like, what? What do you mean? What do you mean? I said, look, all of Europe became Lockean in the 18th century. There was a 10-year effort to fuse together Lockeanism and Thomism in the 1960s. And it always ends in failure because in as much as people learn Thomism, they realize you can't be a Lockean. Because the human person cannot be based on self-interest. I'm sorry. And there's no absolute right to private property. All right to private property is conditional. I'm sorry. There is a right to private property, but it's conditional. It's not absolute. Right? So, but essentially on the eve of the French Revolution, there were no Thomists in Europe. Or there were very few. And in many of the seminaries, seminary education was, for the most part, what is the modern, if the philosophical education was, what is the modern philosophy of the day? We just kind of adopt it, Lockeanism. And then on top of that, we teach them apologetics. Right? So one of the beautiful things since the French Revolution wipes out most of Catholicism in Europe. And then, so in the 1820s and 1830s, there's two camps that start to develop in Europe. One camp is really led by I would call them the naturalists. And these people basically believe that everything we were doing before the French Revolution, we should just keep doing it and just advance it even further. This is both in secular and in Catholic circles. But there was another branch, and I think this is really represented most by Joseph de Maistre, that basically argued we need to understand, it's not that we need to go back in time and reestablish something from the past, but we need to study we need to study what was lost. What seeds were lost? Or what was done well at a certain point that got dropped? And we need to try to figure out if there's a way that we can understand those principles that have been lost or forgotten, and can we bring them back? And can we make them somehow relevant again? Not the practices, but at least we could develop new practices based on those seeds or those principles. And that leads to Disney! Romanticism, right? It leads to Romanticism. The whole movement, and the first Romanticists were secularists who were saying things like we got to go back to medieval Europe, to not to just to redo it, but we got to understand what was good about back then. What principles were they trying to implement? And in France and Germany, a third of the Romanticists became Catholic. They said the one thing we're missing is Catholicism. So in 2008 or 2009, I got an email from Father Farrell Peternell. And Father Farrell asked me, do you have any colleagues that would be interested in going to a conference in Estonia? I got the email in May for a conference in September. So I asked around to all my colleague friends, would you be interested in going to a conference in Estonia? I understand there might be some Catholics there, and I think they're trying to help out some poor forgotten nation. And all my colleagues were like, nope, can't do it. Too short a notice. It's not professionally relevant. It won't pad my CV. I don't make those kind of sacrifices. So I responded to Father Farrell and I said, well, I just asked all my colleagues that I can, and nobody's interested, but I'll go. So Father Farrell said, well, let me ask let me ask the organizers if they would be interested in having you go. So I went. The one colleague I didn't ask, I went to his house for tea that day, and we were having tea and cookies because I could still eat cookies at that time. And so I said to him, "Hey, I've been invited to this conference in Estonia. I might be invited to this conference in Estonia." And he said to me, "Oh, that's very interesting because I was about to invite you to the conference in Estonia." So he had also been invited through a different route to this conference in Estonia. And so we went to the conference, and it's beautiful to be there. The family that hosted it, they essentially ran the conference in what was an abandoned monastery. It was a Dominican monastery in the center of the main city that had been abandoned sometime during the Reformation. And so Taivo, who was the organizer, I was really impressed when I got there because it seemed like this group that organized this conference, they were Catholics. And it seemed like they owned like the whole city block in Tallinn. Like they owned this little old monastery. They owned a bunch of art shops. They had started a Catholic school, which was called St. Michael's. It only had like 10% Catholic students. But all the elite theater and journalist people in Tallinn sent their little kids to the St. Michael's school. So I got to talking with, actually, it was funny. Taivo didn't know English, but he knew French. So I could talk to him in French at the time. But basically, he told me a story, and I thought, this is a classic example of Romanticism. Taivo, in the late 1970s, was a musician. He was a popular musician in Tallinn. He was friends with Pärt, this famous Estonian classical musician, classical composer. Ivo Pärt, is that his name? You don't know classical music in here?
Not Estonian.
No, this guy's world famous. He's a world famous composer. I mean, people know about him. Like, there's programs about him on NPR, right? So he's got to be important.
National People Radio.
That's right. So anyway, this guy Taivo at one point asked himself the question. He said that he reasoned in this way. He said, "My country." This was 1970s Estonia, which was completely communist, right? He said, "My country is an ugly country. The only thing that's beautiful in my country are certain parts of the main city, Tallinn. I have to figure out why these parts of the city are beautiful so I can try to make my country beautiful again. Make Estonia great again." And so he did research, he did historical research, and he discovered all the beautiful parts of the city were built when Estonia was Mary's land, when it was Catholic. So he converted to Catholicism. And because he was somewhat of a known musician in Estonia, about 800 people converted with him. And that more than doubled the size of the Catholic Church in Estonia. So then in 2008, 2009, they had started this, because they had this school, and because they owned the city block, and they had all these arts and crafts offices, they were able to buy all of that using EU money. So once Estonia joined the EU, they basically said, for historical preservation, we need money for our Trialogos Foundation. And they got money from the EU to buy back the Catholic Cathedral, to buy back this thing, to buy back another school, another building, to make the school. And now they were starting this Trialogos conference as a way of trying to now enter into more of the university. And for them, Trialogos meant theater, music, and philosophy. So they asked me to give a little thing there on the City of God, and I forget what my friend talked about. But anyway, we went for 2 years. We went to the conference for 2 years. And then they ran out of money because at some point the economy crashed. Maybe we went in 2007 and 2008, and then in 2008 the economy crashed, so they didn't have enough money to invite outsiders after that. So the Trialogos continues. And of course, all the so that's an example of Romanticism at work. And that's kind of what happened in the 1820s and 30s. And so some of the followers of Joseph de Maistre, they basically, they were Catholic or they converted to Catholicism, and they basically did research into medieval philosophy and came up with the idea of we should all study as Thomas Aquinas. And that's really the birth of modern Thomism. It was a minority of philosophers in France and Germany and some in Italy that basically said they were like romanticists, that we're going back to the Middle Ages in order to try to recover the principles of what had been lost, with the idea that once you recover those principles, then you'll have a lens through which you can properly understand and critique Voltaire and Locke and Kant and then Hegel or Spinoza or any of the modern philosophers up to that point, right? So the whole idea of these original Thomists was, first you got to know Aquinas and how he taught and what the principles of faith and reason are. Then you'll have a lens for understanding all of the disasters that happened to us in the last 200 years. Because clearly before the French Revolution, they didn't have the intellectual apparatus to critique what was coming. Because they didn't have Thomism. They all just kind of bought hook, line, and sinker the philosophy of the day, whether it was Rousseau or Locke or Kant or Voltaire. So, question?
Even the Jesuits?
The Jesuits were anti. So at a certain point, in the mid 18th century, Voltaire came out as a materialist, even an anti-Lockean, and the Jesuits they turned against him at that point. They turned against the moderate Enlightenment in France, and so they were not Thomist though. And in as much as they were against it, they were not Thomist and against it before the French Revolution.
What year is De Maistre?
De Maistre is like 1815 to 1830. That's when he's writing his best books.
He's Catholic?
Oh yeah.
What's his background?
He was a French aristocrat who exiled. He fled to Russia during the Revolution, and I think he ended up his life there.
I'd sort of heard that there was sort of a revival of St. Thomas's thought at the Council of Trent. Is that?
Yeah, there was,
Okay.
but it was still limited.
Okay.
There was, but it was limited.
Well, Leo the 13th or something. Also.
Well, so we're getting there. We're getting there. No, so essentially what happens is that you get this buildup of you get a minority, you get a strong minority of Thomists developing in the 19th century. And then ironically, one of those hard-headed Thomists gets elected Pope, Leo the 13th. And he would have been a minority among even Catholic philosophers in the 19th century. So then he writes Aeterni Patris, basically saying Thomism is the preferred philosophy of the church, and we got to implement it in our seminaries and in our Catholic schools,
That's huge.
right? So it first really gets implemented in France. The French are the first ones to take it seriously. The Americans don't take Thomism seriously until about the 1920s, right? So basically from 1920 until like the mid-1960s, that's the first generation. And actually, the French Catholics took Thomism seriously, but the French government in 1911 turns really hostile, anti-Catholic. So many of the first French Thomists of the 20th century, they come to the United States. Etienne Gilson, Jacques Maritain, Charles de Connick. Someone else went up to Montreal. There were a few other minor figures, but all these guys come to the United States in the 1930s. And pretty much they're more accepted in the United States than they are in France. And so you see you see a first generation of an attempt to implement Thomism in Catholic universities in the United States from 1930 until 1965 or so.
What universities?
The principal one was Notre Dame. But I mean, all the Jesuit universities, almost all Catholic universities. You talk to any Catholic, almost at any Catholic university in the 1950s, they had to take 7 or 8 philosophy classes. And they were all Thomists. And they were all taught with the Thomistic manuals. The first effort at Thomism in many places was mixed. It was mixed because it was like first generation people getting PhDs. They had mixed talents. Some of them probably were getting PhDs beyond what their talents merited. But so there's a mixed effort at these manuals, the people that wrote them. Grenier is one of the manuals that was written during that time, for example. But basically, I think what you see happening is that all gets, from 65 to 80, that all gets wiped out. Because all these, like Notre Dame in 65, abandoned Thomism. And really, and that's an example where Notre Dame abandoned Thomism so that it could get Rockefeller money. It could get foundation money. Right? So that's an example where money influences educational policy, just like Plato said. Right?
The clubs.
Yeah. In order to get into those clubs, Hesburgh felt he had to disassociate with the Catholic Church and get rid of Thomism at Notre Dame. And so in the mid-60s, he turned the philosophy department from a Thomist department, which had a variety of schools. They were by no means monolith, but he turned that from a Thomist department into some sort of pluralist department. And then I would say by the 90s, it went from being pluralist to specialist. So that's a quick version of Thomism. And it's also to say that Thomism, to answer the question is, in the early 60s, there were enough Thomists crawling around to where the Thomists in the United States, the young Thomists in the United States, thought, we can now do studies where we take the philosophy of Thomas and we use it to critique, some modern philosopher, some modern branch of philosophy. So, for example, one of my mentors, Ralph McInerney, he, in the 50s, wrote a dissertation using Thomism to critique the philosophy of Soren Kierkegaard. But then both McInerney and then later on, the guy at CUA, the guy who was dictator of the CUA Catholic philosophy department, from Jude Doherty. Both McInerney and Jude Doherty told me the same thing. They both realized in the early 1960s that we were entering into at least a generation of chaos. And they both realized that in a generation of chaos, it's very difficult to advance the tradition in a creative way. It's very difficult to use the tradition because why? Most people will lose their way in the chaos. So they both realized you just have to commit yourself at that point to preserving the tradition and handing it on, so that some future generation could re-begin the creative work of using St. Thomas in order to critically critique some modern philosopher. And actually, it's interesting. So many of the priests of the work, when they were studying in Rome, I know one priest of the work who's older, like a generation older than me. He wanted to do a dissertation on Thomas and Dostoevsky, and they told him, no, now's not the time. Why? Because it was a time of confusion, right? But when I was in Rome, there was a guy that wrote a dissertation on Thomas and Dostoevsky, because the thought was that by the time I was in Rome, we were leaving, we had enough people around so that we could do these kind of studies. So part of it might just be generational, that we don't yet have somebody of the younger generation who's trained as a Thomist then to do the critique in that way of Foucault.
Do you think that's an interesting endeavor?
I think I don't know if it's interesting, but I think it's urgent. Because look, if 80% of the dissertations out there are being written on Foucault, you got to deal with them. Or you don't know, if there's cancer and you're trying to solve the problem, if you're trying to, if there's some sort of new cancer out there and you're trying to figure out its cause so you can get the cure to the disease, wouldn't you study the people that have cancer and try to figure out where they're getting it from? Well, likewise, if Black Lives Matter and LGBT this and all these cultural movements out there, if the intellectual apparatus behind them is Foucault, wouldn't it behoove you to understand that so as to critique it, to help lead the people who are stuck in it out of it if you could? I think so. I think it's urgent. There's been a couple studies done by, I have two friends who have done studies on Foucault, and I just sent, one is 50 pages in this book. And then the other one wrote a whole book on Foucault, but not from a Thomist perspective. My other friend is trained more as a political economist, actually. So he critiques Foucault from the standpoint more of political economy, and also narrative, than anything else. I think one thing that will remove the impact of Foucault is just there are some. I've already seen this happen. There are some that get caught up in the Foucaultian trajectory, and they eventually they learn in the bitter school of experience, as Ben Franklin would say. And so they hit a kind of rock bottom, and then they try to there's this one guy who I met on a retreat. So he had all these Foucaultian professors at his college out there in Oregon. What's the famous Reed College? He went to Reed College, and he was there at Oregon with his girlfriend, and they were despairing of life. And they heard a video. They heard one of my friends who gave a video on YouTube critiquing Foucault, and it drew them to the Catholic Church, actually. Yeah, he who shall not be named. Yeah, that's right. But actually, it drew them to convert to Catholicism. And then this year, he was baptized at St. Paul's at Harvard.
Oh, great.
And so I think there are some that will learn in the bitter school of experience. I think people who get enamored with Foucault, it is somewhat hard to argue with them. But I think you can, so for example, I've been brought to some, the grad students have brought me to some gatherings with all the other grad students. And unlike the liberals, the Foucaultians are interested in hearing out what the Catholics have to say. Right? Because the liberals are just like classical liberals, and they have this kind of I was talking with someone about this. They have this kind of superiority complex, this kind of Harvard feigning objectivity while they're foisting their subjective liberalism on you. It's like classic East Coast personae, right? So the liberals, they don't only give you the time of day so much, but at least some of the Foucaultians, they're willing to stand across from you and start asking questions to draw you out a little bit. And they're somewhat intrigued, right? So there is, at least it seems to me with some Foucaultians, there's a little bit of chance to get a foot in the door that way. I'm sure some liberals are that way too. But in my experience, not as many. So this question here is, how does libertarian economics fall behind Foucaultian lines? So I think just to make it clear, Foucault only really embraced Austrian economics when he got to San Francisco in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And I think that's because he made a kind of pact with the capitalist establishment that I will be able to, in other words, I think Foucault thought, if we were to go into his mind, I think we could say something like this happened. I think Foucault thought libertarianism ultimately there's going to be a intellectual opening to my brand of life. Kind of social libertarianism and economic libertarianism, they can intellectually fit together. So I think Foucault, as a leader of leftist thought, basically made a deal with the establishment. I will convince the left to give up serious economic Marxism, and in exchange for that, we'll be able to do whatever we want as far as sexual revolution. And I think the economic establishment was happy with that because they realize that people who are the slaves of their passions are easier to control, both economically and politically. That's classical sophism. That's not a new thought. Right? So I think it was more a marriage of convenience, of intellectual convenience, than anything else.
Do you have a sense for who specifically you have made this pact with?
So I think Foucault was very good with. I think he made the pact with the devil. I think that's for sure. But I don't think he made I don't think he signed a contract with any one foundation. But I think he knew. I think when he came to the States, he knew that there were people in the establishment and in the foundations that realized the value of his ideas in a kind of Machiavellian way. That they realized that there's a value, if you're a Machiavellian, the best way to control a population is divide and conquer. if you and also the kind of Lockean dream of just having isolated individuals who are pursuing their material comfort on their property with their absolute right to property, right? If you just have a bunch of divided individuals in this way, that population is much easier to control than people who are united under a religious principle. So I think Foucault understood the dynamic of a popular intellectual. That the elite, the establishment, the foundations, people who are smart within the government, within the CIA, they always have their eyes on intellectuals. They're always keeping track of what they're doing, and if any of their ideas could be useful for their purposes. So I think a Machiavellian from inside the establishment saw Foucault's ideas and basically said, these are great ideas for divide and conquer. And I think Foucault understood that, and that's in part why he went in that trajectory at the end of his life. Yes. Question? Or
Like which foundations in particular were interested in him?
well, it would be, I don't know that, to be honest, I don't know the names of them, but I do know they funneled a lot of money to Notre Dame, to people like Joseph Buttigieg and Gary Gutting, as I said last class. My guess it would be like, if I were to start doing research on this, I would start with like the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. There are articles now written on Foucault's life, which have unearthed documents showing that there were factions within the CIA that also started to promote Foucault's ideas in universities. So that's what I would point to. For intellectuals that go to places like Harvard, or in France who go to the elite colleges in France, there's always a point in their lives where they realize I could just become like a research intellectual and just immerse myself in becoming like a researcher and make some advances with 12 other people in my field, and we could become friends and go to conferences the rest of our lives and have nice wine and cheese dinner, like live genteel poverty and make a contribution in some sort of indirect way in that way. But then there's also some that realize I could become a public intellectual, right? I could maybe not do as much research, but I could read the writings, the writings of those guys that do the primary research, and I can put it together, or I could direct research and put it together in such a way that it would be popular. Usually these people have to be really smart. And I think Foucault, by the late 60s, realized that he could replace Jean-Paul Sartre as the leader of the French radical establishment. And so I think it would be the late 60s, early 70s that happened. So what is the current relationship between the followers of Foucault and Marx? So essentially, I think, yes, there still are some Marxists out there, but so, for example, at Elmbrook, Bobby Marsland is the guy he works with at Boston University is a physicist, but this physicist's wife is the editor of Jacobin magazine, which is like the leading actual Marxist magazine in the United States. But they hate Foucault, and they hate the followers of Foucault, and they hate Gramsci, because these guys are like just genuine. Like they're Indians, right? So they're just materialist Indian Marxists, like Indian from India Indians.
Oh.
Right? So you stole the words out of my mouth, actually. I have to admit.
Wait.
No, but I have to admit, you did steal the words out of my mouth. So that's good. That's good. We're thinking along the same line, right? But no, so they want nothing to do with this kind of nouveau cultural what they call kind of cultural Marxism, Foucaultian Marxism, because it's not they've lost track of economic justice. And I would say there's so if these people end up being united for a brief moment in time, they will very quickly afterwards be slitting each other's throats. Right?
So neo-Marxism is just really saturated with Foucault.
I think neo-Marxism is really a brand of Foucaultianism in most cases, because it's going after cultural subversion.
And it's Marxism because it hangs on to.
I think it's just a title that it uses, or it's a title people give to it. And like, I think there's a lot of Catholic commentators out there right now. Everything I'm talking about here, they don't know and they don't want to know. And it's much easier for them just to brand things Marxism. And actually, so I'll say this now. We might as well say this now. We were going to say it at some point anyway. No, just to give you an example of there is a kind of attempt to manipulate the Catholic press to accept these cheap labels and not to do serious, not to kind of look into the causes of things. So I was involved in this in 2006 to 2010, where I knew a guy who was starting. Let's go take a step back. So Hilaire Belloc wrote this great book called The Free Press. It's a great book. It's very relevant for our age. In The Free Press, Hilaire Belloc says that he's writing right in 1905, 1906, and he says, one of the difficulties with the current press is that the current press is essentially an imperial press. It's controlled by the corporations and the government, the major papers. You can't say anything in the major papers unless it's vetted by the government and certain corporations, because the papers survive based on donations from wealthy men and from government support and from advertising. And that's all controlled in this kind of network of imperial politics. So the only real press that where you can get information from is what he calls the free press. And what's the free press? The free press are those small newspapers in every city, secular and Catholic, that have very little money and a few people run them. And they tend to be, he goes into all their strengths and weaknesses. They tend to be cranky, right? They tend to get angry very easily. They tend to be focused on one issue at a time because they don't have a lot of people and they have no money. He says, but usually if you want to get to the truth of things, if you read a variety of sources from the free press, that enables you to get a more accurate picture of what's actually happening, to see through the distortions of the imperial press, right? And I think the internet right now functions exactly the same way that Belloc describes the free press. So it's like it's one of those books where,
Discourse?
pardon?
Like public discourse? Public discourse.
Well, just the fact that there's anyone really, if they want to make a website and get views out there. So,
Yeah.
And provide. So now you have tons of people giving views instead of just these,
Right,
giant corporations who control the big.
right.
media.
Who control the imperial media? So I think the internet is kind of like that right now,
Sure.
and so you see all these little news sites that they have all the defects that Belloc recognizes, but also if you read a collection of them, you do kind of get a better sense of what's actually happening and what the facts are, because they're really dedicated to trying to get to the facts, among other things, right? But the danger, but Belloc also says this, and it's also true of these smaller things. The danger of these smaller things is that they're always short of money. And so it's very easy for someone to come in and promise them money to condition their editorial line. Right? So actually, historians have documented how this has happened up until at least the 1990s, especially with smaller presses. I know of 2 or 3 where I'm pretty sure I know what happened because I know the founders. And the founders told me things that confirm my suspicions. But I was involved with one, an internet one, where basically there were 3 guys involved in this internet thing, kind of starting like a new internet press thing. And one of the guys, his father was a CIA agent, but his father died like 20 years ago. So this guy one day got a call from an old CIA agent. The guy says, "Oh, I was friends with your dad. I'd like to get together with you. I hear you have now 4,000 subscribers to your website. I'd love to get together with you and talk about it." This was in 2005 or 6. Yeah, it'd be 2005, about 2006. This is right at the time where they were trying to ramp up anti-Russian propaganda. So So my friend goes into this little meeting. He goes into this meeting, it's like 4 CIA agents. And they say, we want you to watch this film. And it's a film about how Vladimir Putin is still a secret Marxist. That's the whole film is like some sort of, it's a complete propaganda film, but it's how he, grew up as a communist. He was a communist, this, that, and the other thing. He was an agent in the KGB, but then he's always kept this secret Marxism alive in his heart. And then at some point, he's going to flip Russia into a Marxist communist society. And these guys make my friend the offer. They say, if you are willing to popularize this film and these ideas, we guarantee that your news site will never go out of business. You'll always have the financing you need for your news site. You won't have to rely on subscriptions anymore. So this guy came to me and my friend, my other friend, who were not part of the business. And he asked us, what do you think? Do you think I should take the money? So we told him absolutely not. You can't sell your soul to the devil here. But by that point, we had, the two of us combined, already had experience of other institutions that had taken the money. And we just said, look, it's not worth compromising your editorial line. Better to suffer for the truth than to live in comfort the rest of your life. So I know this kind of stuff happens, right? So intellectuals can always be pressured in this way, especially public intellectuals, right? To condition a little bit what they're saying, because they know that the people that are giving them the money have a certain editorial line they want to hold them to. And I think this is what's happened in the Catholic press, right? I think a lot of the Catholic press, they've just been conditioned to kind of accept the Marxist line, right? Just to use the Marxist label. And I think many of these sources, they're getting money. And they're getting money so long as they keep using the Marxist label, right? So I think the money, in a sense, prevents them from doing a little bit more research. Because there is a kind of, both in the dynamics of internal politics and also foreign politics, there is a kind of advantage that both parties seek for creating simple labels, right? If you can just take if you can take an entire class or an entire party, and you can just define it with a simple label, that's much easier than saying, well, there are these cultural Marxists at the Jacobin magazine, and then there's followers of Foucault, and no politician is going to do that, right? So because the label, it's just easier. It's just easier in politics to make the label, right?
Do you think First Things takes money?
Yes, I think they, at least at their founding, they did. I know for a fact they did. The money came from Norman. It's in a book written by Murray Friedman, the Rise of Neoconservatism, Norman Podhoretz. And Norman Podhoretz was the guy that was getting money for founding magazines. They had a Jewish magazine, which was, I think it's called Commentary. And they realized we need a Catholic equivalent of Commentary. And so they found their man, Richard John Newhouse. They found him the money. I know for a fact because I talked with Ralph McInerney about this. They used Ralph McInerney as the conduit for getting him the money. And the deal, at least the initial deal for First Things was, don't criticize American foreign policy, don't criticize free market capitalism, and then you can say whatever you want outside of that, and you'll always stay in business. That was the initial deal under Newhouse. I don't know if that deal continues to this day, because Newhouse is dead and Norman Podhoretz is dead. But I do know that the donors made the current editor apologize for criticizing wearing a mask. The current donors made him apologize for his critiques of wearing the mask. I don't know if that's as serious as foreign policy and free market capitalism, but that was the deal for the foundation both of Crisis Magazine in the 80s and First Things. And to my knowledge, most Catholic newspapers and magazines of that kind were made that deal in the 80s and 90s. And I know two magazines that that got the offer and rejected it.
What are those?
The New Oxford Review and Culture Wars.